The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time and postpone any votes with respect to any measure considered in this meeting. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I'm going to begin with a brief opening statement just to cover some housekeeping, and then our item of business here is to approve the rules, which we will do, and with a little bit of time, I'd be happy to recognize members for a minute or so for questions or other things, but obviously we can chat after the hearing if we are low on time. Just a few housekeeping things. First, in front of you, you have 3 books. You're welcome for your August homework assignment there. Really good stuff, and will ground us in, I think, some really, really important research on the topics of economic disparity. Secondly, you will find in front of you a draft potential preliminary list of hearings. This doesn't represent a ton of thought, but it's given to you for purposes of soliciting your ideas, feedback on not just topics of hearings, but sequence of hearings and potential witnesses. During the month of August, the committee staff and I will work to create a work plan in which we'll order the hearings. You'll notice that the hearings are both subject matter related, but also the chairman is very taken with the idea of doing a lot of field hearings, so we can actually get out there and see what disparity looks like in different parts of the country. And obviously, since we come from different geographies, I'd love you all to give some thought to what that would look like. Finally, I just want to update you quickly on some we've met individually, but just talking about sort of the missions and activities of the committee. This is sort of crystallized in my head as a threefold set of tasks. Number one, traditional tasks of a committee will be taking testimony, doing analysis, and seeking solutions to the issues of economic disparity, solutions that could be legislative, solutions that need not be legislative. There's no reason why we can't make suggestions to the executive, to the private sector, to the philanthropic sector. And so that is, in some senses, our core mission. Secondarily, I continue to be taken, I've shared with you and had extensive conversations with some of the membership about a sort of documentarian role here of really lifting up the voices and the experiences of people who are living in different contexts of disparity around the country. I call this showing America to itself, and we're going to make a real commitment to making sure that as we get out there, we hear the stories of people, we document the stories of people. This is really based in some of the wonderful work that was done, amongst other things, by the Work Progress Administration in the 1930s with the documentation of a lot of what America was going through at the time. And then finally, I think, as I've shared with all of you, despite the fact that we find ourselves caught up in the argument over the January 6th Commission and therefore do not have Republican members joining us this morning, I hope that that will be resolved soon. And I really hope that a third objective of all of us will be to demonstrate a level of comity and bipartisanship and humility and openness that shows our appreciation for the magnitude of the task that we face and the universality of the problem that we're here to address. Though we're not joined by Republicans today, if you look at a map of the United States, it is in fact red areas in which in the aggregate disparity is most intense. So I'm hopeful that we'll proceed in a way that recognizes that this is not fundamentally a partisan problem. In the service of that goal, I think our touchstone has to be rooted always in evidence, in fact, in good analysis. We will entertain any ideas, but you'll hear this refrain from the chairman, we'll consider any idea, but bring facts. I think that's going to be one of the ways that we can sort of filter out some of the more political, maybe partisan orientation. We've got to be rooted in evidence and good analysis. To that end, I'm going to do everything I can as chairman to encourage debate and colloquies. I've now spent more than a decade listening to series of 5-minute speeches, and I'm not sure that a whole lot of learning happens when that is what happens. So I'd encourage you, and I'm going to encourage the Republicans, to find ways to engage in colloquies and dialogue designed to get towards the facts and the truth here. And then finally, as I said before, I'm really hoping that we can focus on ideas. Not on motives, not on political ideologies, and certainly not on labels. The chairman is not going to be thrilled with what happens all too often around here, which is Democratic ideas are dismissed by labeling them as socialism. Republican ideas are dismissed by simply labeling them as Republican talking points. Labeling ideas doesn't move the argument forward. So I'm hoping that we can all sort of get into that mind frame. That's all I've got by way of opening statements. Let's take care of the rules, and then I'm happy to take the remainder of the time to get anything on record that the membership would like to do. So pursuant to notice, the committee will now consider a resolution to adopt the committee's rules, which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report the resolution.
A resolution to adopt rules of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives.
Without objection, the resolution is considered as read and open for amendment. Seeing no amendments, the question is now on adoption of the rules. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The resolution is adopted, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, committee staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes to the resolution under consideration. Before we adjourn, the hearing begins in 6 minutes. I'm happy to recognize any members or entertain ideas or thoughts. Maybe if anybody has anything they'd like to get on the record, I'll move by order of seniority. Let's keep remarks to a minute or so, given the time. But yes, Ms. Capter.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, first of all, congratulations to you and to all of our members. Welcome to the first hearing. I wanted to thank you for your openness and conversations regarding what each of us might think important as we move forward. And I'm very happy to see our part of the country included. Generally, it's not in caucus deliberations. So I thank you very much for keeping the door open. And we look forward to reading the volumes that you've placed before us, perhaps considering some of our own to offer in the weeks ahead. And we look with great anticipation to the ability to look at not just individual household disparities, but regional disparities across our country and what has happened economically, quite different, both in texture and substance and longevity. I would just say in terms of my part of the country, and by that I define it as the Great Lakes states, the difference between us perhaps at the moment and the Deep South. The Deep South has never had the joy of having a strong middle class. Our part of the country used to. And so I think I would say one of the defining characteristics of what has occurred in our region is the falling out of the floor underneath people and the continued winnowing of middle-class jobs. Though we struggle hard, every time you seem to have a success, you've got another failure in front of you. So I think the politics of the region is also impacted by all of that, and so the economic imperative is paramount in our region. And as some of the materials will show, we're the only part of the country that doesn't have a federal development umbrella of some type over it. And I think this is a real shortcoming as one looks at the long arch of history. So thank you very much, and we look forward to being constructive as the weeks ensue. And I see the speakers out there, and we thank her very much for her leadership in establishing this very important working committee. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Capter. We've got 3 or 4 minutes before the hearing begins. Would any other members like to be recognized? Ms. Moore?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I won't repeat anything that the distinguished lady from Ohio has mentioned. I also am from the Midwest. I think this is a very comprehensive list of hearings and roundtables, and I see we got quite a bit of summer reading here to do, which I look forward to. So long as we're reading things, I think the thing that I would like to look at is where the New Deal, the New Deal left people behind. It was wonderful for who it took care of, but the people that it didn't, it was a raw deal for them. And I do have someone from my constituency that from the day one, when this committee was proposed, said, I will do anything to help work. And he, of course, has written a book about time for a New Deal 3.0, David Reamer. So I would just commend that to the committee at some point. I did send, he's on Amazon, his book, Forward by Gwen Moore. Uh, So it's a pretty good book. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. We've got about 1 or 2 minutes before the hearing begins. Any other desire to be recognized by order by seniority? Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Chairman Himes, and thank you, Speaker Pelosi, for your foresight in establishing this committee. We are at a time when poverty is at such an enormous, income inequality is at such an enormous high, and poverty, of course, because of the work that Democrats have done, that the House of Representatives and the Senate and the President have signed into law, we have been able to cut poverty somewhat. But we need to think about the underlying forces that really create this inequality in the country. And the only thing I would add here, Mr. Chairman, is the question of monopoly power, which I think has really led to a lack of competition and innovation across the country, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in terms of small businesses. There's a huge opportunity, I think, for us to take on this question, and it does have bipartisan support. And so that is one piece that I would add on. But I'm so excited to have this select committee and to be able to address these issues with the seriousness and the thoroughness of investigation, and hopefully with the ability to really get worker power at the center of what we are trying to do. As the President has said, rising wages is not a bug. It is actually a feature of design. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my colleagues, thrilled to serve on this committee, and of course to the Speaker, thank you for establishing this. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jayapal. In deference to the fact that it's the top of the hour, I'm going to adjourn the hearing, but of course, all members are welcome to consult with the chairman afterwards. In fact, invited. Some of you came in a bit late. You'll see a page in front of you of proposed draft preliminary hearings. Please, we need your feedback in terms of additional hearings, sequencing, witnesses, et cetera. With that, the rules are adopted and we are adjourned. To the members, just informal advice. Just so that there's no surprises. My intent will be to allow a member at the 5-minute mark to, within reason, finish a question. But if it goes beyond the 5-minute mark, the witness will have to answer for the record. I will also let witnesses, within reason, finish answers beyond the 5-minute mark. But if the question does extend past the 5-minute mark, we're going to need to get the answer for the record. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members not on the committee are authorized to participate in today's hearing, and we are fortunate this morning to have the Speaker of the House join us, and she will be recognized shortly. This hearing is entitled "The Nature and Consequences of American Economic Disparity." I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Good morning, and I would like to welcome our witnesses and our members to this inaugural hearing of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth. One of our witnesses notes in his testimony that this is a committee of historic potential. As the Speaker of the House has made clear, this committee is the successor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's National Economic Committee of 1938. The National Economic Committee operated in a moment of economic crisis worse than any of us have seen in our lifetimes, the Great Depression. The Great Depression showed America that far too many citizens of the richest and most powerful country in the world could be impoverished by unpredictable forces beyond their control. It showed that free market capitalism was both an unparalleled engine of economic growth and, if left unregulated, subject to manipulation, indifferent to fairness, and prone to collapse. In most respects, the American economy is more stable and the safety net is more robust than it was 80 years ago. But today, our economy demonstrates more income and wealth disparity and less mobility than it ever has. This is not a trivial problem. Market economies don't work if they are perceived as fundamentally unfair or rigged. Our democratic political system rests, now uneasily, on the premise that every American counts equally. That premise is hard to maintain when a few Americans live in near royal opulence while most struggle to put food on the table and to educate their children. Economic mobility, the idea that hard work and playing by the rules allow one to climb the ladder, has always been essential to understanding ourselves. It defines the American dream. And yet, when my parents were born, more than 90% of American children would make more money than their parents. Today, fewer than half of children will out-earn their parents. I see this every day at home. Some of the towns I represent on Connecticut's so-called Gold Coast include the wealthiest people on the planet. But a 15-minute drive will take them into cities with horrendous poverty and neighborhoods where opportunity is scarce at best. There are at least 3 problems with this disparity, problems that this committee will struggle with. First, poverty amidst great wealth must offend our moral values and our hopes for fairness and justice. Second, great economic disparity appears to reduce our economic productivity and growth. And third, I have very little doubt that increasing disparity and decreasing opportunity will continue to erode our democratic system of government. For over a year now, our nation has had a long overdue reckoning with questions of racial justice. With civility and humility, those conversations will continue here. I'm not sure anyone imagined or hoped that an American's opportunity would be heavily influenced, if not determined, by their race, their gender, or the neighborhood in which they were born. So that's why we're here. We will listen. We will reflect and analyze in an intellectually humble way, deferential to facts and to learning. We will recommend solutions to ourselves, to the president, to the private sector, to the nonprofit sectors. We will lift up the experiences and voices of Americans everywhere who are living in the context of disparity. Finally, this committee will operate in a manner worthy of the magnitude of the problem that we seek to solve. Our approach will be humble. Our disagreements will be constructive, and our conduct and language will reflect the best that this country has to offer and what our constituents expect of us. So we have work to do, and I'm excited to do it with all of you. With that, I yield and am delighted to ask for unanimous consent to recognize the Speaker of the House, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi, who conceived this committee for as much time as she may consumed. Speaker, you are recognized.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your inspiring opening statement. You presented a vision and a plan on how we can address the disparity in our country when it comes to opportunity and growth. You really spoke in the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt when he spoke out about what the disparity meant to our democracy. As Congresswoman Moore and our distinguished Mr. Clyburn have told us, the New Deal was not a good deal for everyone in our country. We have to make sure as we go forward, we learn from the past and recognize all of the possibilities. Because near 80 years ago, as a result of the devastation of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt established the temporary National Economic Committee to study the concentration of wealth in America and its role in triggering the Depression. FDR, establishing the committee, said, "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. The liberty of democracy," he went on to say, "is not safe if its business system does not provide employment and produce and distribute goods in such a way as to sustain an acceptable standard of living." Today, our economy and our country face a similar threat to the liberty of our democracy. We know that the middle class is the backbone of our democracy. We also know that if we strengthen the middle class, we strengthen our democracy. It's not just about the middle class, it's about those who aspire to it. Economic inequality, which has been growing for years, has intensified during the pandemic. The widening chasm between CEO compensation and worker pay has gone from unfair to immoral. The stagnation of wages is a picture of injustice. In December, I announced the creation of the Select Committee of Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth to study and combat this crisis. We must ensure that our economy works for everyone while powering strong economic growth for years to come. Under the leadership of Chairman Himes, the committee has committed to hearing both from those who have the greatest needs and those who have the greatest understanding of the crisis from both sides, the need side and the solution side. To that end, I'm very honored that we have the participation of our witnesses here today. Jason Furman, former chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. I know you'll be introducing them, but I want to pay my respects as well. Mr. Chairman Joy Cheney of the National Urban League, Professor James Kenneth Galbraith, the University of Texas at Austin, Professor Janet Curry from Princeton, and Shelley Gupta Barnes, the Poor People's Campaign. I know you'll give a fuller introduction momentarily, but I want to thank them for their generosity of time, intellect, and solutions to us today. Our economy and our country face a similar threat to the liberty of democracy, as I said. So in his speech, President Roosevelt further said, "We believe in a way of living in which political democracy and free enterprise for profit should serve and protect each other to ensure a maximum of human liberty, not for the few, but for the all." I look forward to this hearing, which will advance the House's work to build back better and joining our president in a way that ensures liberty, prosperity, and opportunity for all. And we could not be better served to do that, Mr. Chairman, than by your leadership, bringing your extensive professional experience from the private sector and your nonprofit work, as well as your public sector leadership. Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur will be focusing on regional economic revitalization in a way that hopefully will produce the results that we expect. And Congresswoman Grace Moore of Wisconsin, leading action to close the racial wealth gap. Excuse me. Congressman Vicente Gonzalez of Texas, recognizing the connection between economic growth and infrastructure connectivity. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington, delivering workers better wages and a brighter future. Congresswoman Angie Craig of Minnesota, representing the concerns of family farms and rural farmers and rural communities. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez addressing generational disparities and increasing worker power in the economy, and Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs of California focusing on the future of work with both a family and global perspective. This is just doesn't do justice to all of the knowledge, experience, and leadership that all of you bring to this. But I too wanted to pay my respects to the beautiful diversity of the members of this committee. I will add that we have a standing invitation to the Republicans to participate in these proceedings, and hope that they will do so. In the meantime, our hopes are riding on all of you to have a clarity of understanding of the challenges that are faced by families in America who just cannot even thrive because of the disparities, to do so in a way that is solution-oriented, perhaps, as the chairman said, recommendations to the private nonprofit sector, but also to the legislative committees of jurisdiction so that we can take action to make the difference. Again, this is a values-based approach to this. We feel very, very concerned about the immorality of the inequality in our country, and we're going to do something about it. I'm very pleased that our proceedings are live streamed, so we will be hearing from folks as we go along. I thank all of you on the committee, Mr. Chairman, and all of you, and for your leadership, and I'm grateful again to our witnesses for their participation. We look forward to their presentations, and I'm pleased to yield back to our distinguished chairman with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields, and the chairman thanks the Speaker of the House for her vision in establishing this committee and the confidence that you have placed in each one of us to address this enormous problem. Today, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Mr. Jason Furman, the Aetna Professor of Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard University. Next, we have Ms. Joya O'Chaney, Executive Director of the Washington Bureau and Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at the National Urban League. Next, we have Professor James Kenneth Galbraith, Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair in Government and Business Relations at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Next, we have Professor Janet Curry, the Henry Putnam Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. And finally, we have Ms. Shali Gupta-Barnes, Policy Director of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. Witnesses are all reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on the desk in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, to quickly wrap up your testimony so that we can be respectful of both other witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Furman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the really important work that you are undertaking. I wanted to make 6 points in my testimony. The first is that American families are making much slower economic progress than they have in the past. From 1948 to 1973, incomes grew at 3% a year for the typical family. That meant once a generation, they doubled. Now they're barely growing, taking more than 100 years to double, even though overall economic growth has continued at a much faster pace than typical families are seeing. Second, if you want to understand the causes of the slowdown of growth for the incomes of typical families, you have to look at 3 factors. First of all, productivity growth slowed. Second, inequality rose. And third, for a long time, these trends were being combated as more women entered the workforce and you had more two-earner families making up for the slower earnings growth. But lately, over the last 2 decades, that's plateaued, and you haven't seen women continue to enter the workforce, and you've seen men continue to leave the workforce. Third, disparities are pervasive. They're pervasive by income, education, race, ethnicity, gender, and many other dimensions, and they express themselves in almost every area, including the economy, education, environment, health, housing, clean water, crime, and more. Just to give two statistics, the median net worth of Black households is about 15% of what it is for white households. For Hispanic or Latino, it's about 20% of what it is for white households. My fourth point is that economists have studied the issue of income inequality very extensively, and there's a lot of debate over the explanations of increased inequality. I personally find almost every one of the explanations put forward plays a role. The increase in inequality has been large enough that there's room for a lot of explanations. I don't think there's any one cause. And importantly, that means there's not any one single magic bullet solution. You have to pursue a very wide range of solutions. Broadly speaking, I classify the explanations into competitive explanations, which are changes in supply and demand. Demand for workers with higher educational attainment. At the same time, the economy has produced fewer of them, means the equilibrium wage rises for workers with a college degree, but also institutional explanations, the decline of unionization, the decline of the real value of the minimum wage, and a set of measures that affect the bargaining power of workers, like non-compete agreements, no poaching agreements, and collusion in wage setting. So both competitive and institutional features have mattered. Fifth, there are many opportunities to reduce disparities while boosting overall growth, and policymakers should pursue all of these. A really striking paper published in a top economics journal by researchers from the University of Chicago and Stanford found that 20 to 40% of productivity growth between 1960 and 2010 was due to reduced discrimination, sexism, racism, and the like. They didn't find that it was eliminated. They found that it still was very much present, but the fact that there was less of it in 2010 meant more people were contributing to the economy. You can take a look at doctors. They were almost all white men in 1960. By 2010, they were still disproportionately white men, but much less so, and so talent could express itself more fully. Children of a high-income family are 8 times more likely to file a patent than poor children. We're missing out on what my colleagues call lost Einsteins who contribute to the economy. A lot of ways to increase growth and reduce disparities, including education, investments in children, making the economy more competitive, enabling more to work, increasing dynamism, and strengthening the macroeconomy. Finally, I would say there are additional ways policymakers can reduce disparities in order to help American families with relatively little impact on growth, and policymakers should pursue those as well. So as you go forward, I was very pleased to hear how you want to be guided by evidence and facts. These problems are so big that they require a lot of different solutions and grounding those solutions in rigorous evidence. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Mr. Furman. Ms. Cheney, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, and the members of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Joy Cheney, and I serve as Senior Vice President of Policy and Advocacy and Executive Director of the Washington Bureau of the National Urban League. I bring you greetings on behalf of our President and CEO, Mark H. Morial, who regrets he was unable to be here today. For the last 45 years, the National Urban League has published The State of Black America, which serves as a pulse check on the state of progress for Black people in this country. This year's report is appropriately entitled The New Normal: Diverse, Equitable, and Inclusive. It focuses on how our nation can recover from the 3 pre-existing pandemics of systemic racial inequality in healthcare, the economy, and public safety, beginning with Black America, but towards a new normal for all. The COVID-19 pandemic, devastating as it is, has only exacerbated pre-existing disparities that the National Urban League and our other civil rights partners have been working to close and imploring others to join us in closing for more than a century. So we welcome this committee and this hearing. Communities of color have long faced social and racial injustices and inequities across every indicator: education, healthcare, employment, housing, and small business development. Indeed, systemic inequity has been baked into the policies and practices at the federal, state, and local level of this country. This has resulted in vast inequities in our healthcare system, both in insurance and healthcare delivery, an education system that underserves Black children and children of color, a biased employment landscape leading to gross income and wealth disparities between Black and white households, as well as a greater unemployment amongst Black Americans, housing insecurity and home ownership inequity for Black Americans, disproportionate challenges faced by minority small businesses, as was acknowledged by the MDA 10 years ago, more than that. Minority-owned firms are smaller on average than non-minority-owned firms, with lower gross receipts, survival rates, employment, and payrolls. Given that this is where we were pre-pandemic, it is unsurprising that Black America and other communities of color are bearing the heaviest burden of sickness and death, economic disparity, and during this COVID-19 pandemic. And while not the focus of this hearing, Black Americans must also endure health challenges and economic stress of the pandemic while being constantly reminded of the structural and individual racism that exists in our nation, whether on the street, on the internet, in the halls of power, the ballot box, or in our criminal justice system. There is an overwhelming desire to get back to normal. We understand that. But given the litany of disparities that defined our pre-pandemic normal, we cannot and must not return to normal. We are called to reimagine a new normal and forge a diverse, equitable, and inclusive future. To that end, the National Urban League supports a variety of policy solutions and priorities that would work towards building an equitable economic system with fewer economic disparities and fairer growth. We encourage the White House and Congress to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour and strengthen the social safety net through ensuring adequate unemployment insurance, paid family and medical leave, affordable child care, and affordable housing, to expand access to capital for minority-owned businesses, invest in minority-owned banks and CDFIs, and demand accountability from financial institutions, to expand access to government contracting opportunities for minority-owned businesses, including through the upcoming infrastructure package, to close the digital divide, beginning with ensuring access to a broadband benefit for those who cannot afford it, to invest in Title I schools, hardest hit by the pandemic, to use federal authority to deter and remedy discrimination, which still exists, in housing, employment, and education, to invest in down payment assistance and other home ownership programs aimed at expanding wealth in communities of color, and to invest in workforce development and entrepreneurship programs, the heart of the Urban League's movement's direct services. Each of these actions would bring about a new equitable normal that closes our disparities, embraces our diversity, and secures America's position as a world leader for generations to come. The National Urban League looks forward to working with this committee toward that end. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cheney. Professor Galbraith, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Select Committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Select Committee. Mr. Chairman, since you've already made my first point about the historic potential of this committee, I'll move directly to the second, which is a remark from Adam Smith that wealth, as Mr. Hobbes says, is power. Today, we have islands of wealth and power on one side and an ocean of precarity and powerlessness alongside persistent poverty on the other. This is a structural development over 50 years or so, the consequence of politics and policies, but also of industrial change, globalization, new technologies. In a nutshell, an agro-industrial middle-class economy that from the 1930s to the 1970s was centered in the heartland, supplying the world with machinery and food and other goods, while drawing labor up from the South to the Midwest. This economy, which was an economy of trade unions and world-dominant manufacturing corporations, has become a bicoastal economy dominated by globalized finance, insurance, services, information on one coast, information technology, aerospace, and other industries on the other. And the unfortunate fact is that those sectors, which are very successful sectors, do not support a large base of direct employment. They concentrate income and wealth. They're not the only ones historically to do so. Railroads and petroleum are great examples, but they do so very, very efficiently. And so we have a situation in which the largest income and wealth gains in America have become highly concentrated in very specific sectors in very specific places, and there's a lot of struggle in many other places. Most of the jobs that have been created in the last 30 years, and especially since the great financial crisis, have been in services where the wage structure is very flat, where pay is often mediocre and unemployment is unstable. Families therefore compensate characteristically by having two or more earners, sometimes holding two or more jobs. And the normal pattern half a century ago was a single earner earning a living wage. And the result, and this is the big change, is that it takes far more hours of work to sustain a middle-class living standard in work that is less intrinsically rewarding, more precarious than was the case 2 generations ago. It might have been better to maintain the economy that we once had, but it's gone. Globalization and information revolution are irreversible facts of life, and so the question for the Select Committee is, what do you do now? And I believe that we have the tools to address these issues. They have experience doing so, and the question is implementing them. We, in fact, have seen already expanding social insurance, a very powerful tool. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, SNAP. The programs that were put in effect last year, we saw in the paper today, reduced poverty by more than half. It's a very effective thing to do in the short run. I don't think it's a permanent solution, but it's a step that is important. Expanding health care. I'm an incrementalist. I would drop the Medicare age to 55, and that would be a very useful step, just for example. Raise the minimum wage. As Ms. Cheney has already said, a federal minimum wage at $15 an hour would provide a raise to at least 20%, probably more, of working Americans. And of course, it would solve the problem of a so-called labor shortage without disadvantaging any particular employer, because everybody would be subject to the same standard. I would urge the committee to examine closely the proposal to implement a federal job guarantee that would have the effect of eliminating involuntary unemployment and setting wage standards, as well as providing a buffer so that people who need jobs could always get them. This would not be necessarily a large program, but would also help private employers who need to find workers, because they could always find people who have good track records in an employment program of this kind. I think this is a very good solution. Obviously, and there's progress already being made to build public services, infrastructure, and fight climate change, and this lays the basis for the economy of the future. I would add to this that we have, I think, experience that now shows that we need to reduce our military commitments and move resources in that direction. Turning to the other side of the ledger, in fact, toward the question of what you do about great wealth, I think the principle here is that the basis of taxation should be shifted away from labor and also away from business and onto capital rents, essentially, onto land rents, onto mineral rents, onto technology rents, to tax as closely as possible the major accumulations, and to bring, so to speak, the new plutocrats back to earth. And I would urge that the economy broadly be definancialized for the middle class by rebuilding debt-free education and health care. And this would provide essentially a sense of security that would insulate people from financial risks. So with that said, I would urge you to pursue growth, but in this context as a broadly seeking the welfare, fair and equitable welfare for all Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Galbraith. Professor Curry, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm honored to have the opportunity to assist the work of this historic committee. I have studied the harmful effects of economic disparity on children for 30 years, and they are pervasive, but they are also preventable. We know how to address harmful effects of disparities on children, how to promote fairness in children's growth and human capital development. Children are the basis of our future. The harmful effects of economic disparity begin before birth. Disadvantaged pregnant women face stressful circumstances, including economic uncertainty and exposure to violence. Toxic stress leads to lower birth weight babies and future health problems, including asthma, ADHD, and depression as children grow. Disadvantaged pregnant women and their children are more likely to be exposed to environmental toxins. They live closer to busy roads, Superfund sites, plants that emit toxic releases, and are more likely to live in housing that exposes them to lead. These factors have taken a disproportionate toll on people of color. Between 2017 and 2019, Black infants were twice as likely as white infants to be low birth weight and to die in infancy. Black and Native American women were 2 to 3 times more likely to die due to childbirth. Higher rates of diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease among people of color stem in part from early deprivations and place them at higher risk, as we have seen, from diseases such as COVID-19. As children grow, they continue to face unequal opportunities, especially in terms of access to safe and healthy environments and access to a quality education. Differences in opportunities are reflected in disparities in health, mortality, and educational attainment, and ultimately in lower levels of intergenerational mobility. For example, differences in asthma rates between Black and white children can be entirely explained by the combination of a higher incidence of low birth weight and their zip code of residence. Still, the United States has made great strides in reducing the effects of economic disparity on children. Expansions of Medicaid coverage to pregnant women and children and the creation of the Children's Health Insurance Program have saved lives, reduced the incidence of chronic conditions and disability, and increased the future employment and earnings of the children who benefited. Medicaid coverage of women and children has paid for itself and saved 10 million life years. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and child nutrition programs have greatly reduced malnutrition and metabolic syndrome, a cluster of conditions including obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes. They've increased high school graduation rates and reduced future welfare use. Head Start and state and local early education programs have been shown to have long-lasting positive effects on children's educational attainment and to reduce crime. And racial gaps in academic achievement have steadily declined over the past 30 years. Our investments in child health and nutrition have the largest returns among all social programs. Yet significant and damaging disparities remain. The National Academy of Sciences report, A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty, cited overwhelming evidence that poverty damages children. But it also showed that we have the tools to significantly reduce child poverty. The recently adopted child tax credit will reduce child poverty by half. Financial support for families has been shown to increase birth weights, improve maternal mental health, and increase children's future employment. It's important that the credit be made permanent. Universal access to quality early childhood education would extend its benefits to all children who need it and support parents' employment. Because spending on schools serving poor children matters, the COVID relief now flowing to state and local governments offers an opportunity to start to significantly improve schools serving the most disadvantaged children. Paid leave and measures to increase the stability of workers' schedules would allow parents to spend crucial time with their children. Adopting these measures would give American children and families the benefits that families in competing nations already enjoy and would allow every child a chance to realize the American dream.
Thank you, Professor Curry. Ms. Barnes, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hines, Speaker Pelosi, and members of the committee, and my fellow panelists for calling attention to economic disparity in America. I'm the policy director of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. I have a background in economics, law, and human rights, and the experiences gained from working with and for poor and dispossessed people for more than 17 years. The Poor People's Campaign is committed to ending the injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the false narrative of Christian nationalism. We are rooted in more than 2 decades of organizing among poor and low-income people, and over the past 3 years have established a national campaign across 45 states, a network of more than 200 organizational partners, unions, and thousands of faith leaders who together represent tens of millions of people. In 2018, we released The Souls of Poor Folk, a report that looked at the economic trends and policies over the past 50 years that have brought us to this moment. What we have learned is that there are 140 million people in this country who are poor or one emergency away from being poor. And among the 140 million are more than half of our children, 74 million women, nearly 60% or 25 million Black people, 64% or 38 million Latino people, 40% or 8 million Asian people, nearly 60% or 2 million Indigenous people, and 1 out of every 3 or 66 million white people. You all should have fact sheets that relate these facts pertaining to your particular states as well. This amounts to over 40% of our country who are living with low wages, housing, food, and health insecurity, mounting household debts, polluted air and water, and the increasing criminalization and militarized policing of their communities. This comes, as we've heard, with profound physical, emotional, and mental stress from living in these conditions every day. The 140 million is not just a number. In the campaign, across our 45 state campaigns, our leaders and members are among the 140 million. From Appalachia to Alabama, from California to the Carolinas, from the Rust Belt down to the Bible Belt, and across the southern border. Families who have been separated by unjust immigration, incarceration, and welfare policies, communities that are being destroyed by floods, fires, fossil fuels, and fracking, farmers, low-wage workers, caregivers, veterans, students, and so many more people are coming together to not only diagnose these conditions, but offer their solutions. As Mishaila Buckmaster, a formerly homeless single mom from rural Washington, has said, "I wasn't homeless because I was stupid or lazy. I was homeless because our society cares more about the millionaires and billionaires who live in Seattle than a young, pregnant, homeless woman in the middle of winter." Indeed, alongside the 140 million are a small group of people, as we've heard, whose wealth has grown dramatically. Before the pandemic, just 3 people had the same wealth as half the country. And between March 2020 and July 2021, billionaire wealth has grown by almost 60% to 4.7 trillion. These 2 extremes are the predictable outcome of intentional policy choices made over the past several decades that have consistently favored the wealthy, corporations, and financial interests over our communities. Anti-poverty programs have been consistently underfunded, while spending on war, prisons, and immigration enforcement has increased. These choices have been made possible as our democracy has been weakened by voter suppression, keeping those who are most impacted by these skewed priorities out of our political system. There are costs to maintaining a vastly unequal economy, some of which we can count, like the aggregate costs of child poverty coming in at $1 trillion a year, and others which we cannot, like not allowing for 40% of this country to reach their full potential. Because poor and low-income people do not run this country, but they make it run. When they are in crisis, our entire economy and our democracy suffer. At the same time, policies that prioritize the poor have been shown to have economy-wide benefits. Every dollar that goes into raising the minimum wage gets multiplied into $1.20. Every dollar spent on food stamps generates between $1.50 and $1.80 of economic activity. Earlier this year, the Poor People's Campaign released a set of 14 policy priorities that center the 140 million. We know what to do. We have heard it here on this panel. I would add also updating the poverty measure, guaranteeing housing, healthcare, and relieving debts that can't be paid. And how we address economic disparity is to lift the load of poverty off the backs of the 140 million. Rather than waiting for wealth to trickle down from the top, we must lift from the bottom. Lift from the bottom, because when you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barnes. We turn now to member questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to tease out some thinking on something that has not come up this morning from the testimony, and I thank you all for your very good testimony, and that is the role of place and geography, particularly in my district, but around the country. Wealth, human capital, opportunity, are highly concentrated by geography. Things like venture capital investment, highly concentrated by geography. So, Professor Galbraith, let me start with you, just a minute or so, because I'd like to hear from other witnesses as well. But what can we do policy-wise to intelligently address this concentration, geographic concentration of opportunity, and therefore the concomitant concentration of poverty in other areas?
Well, I think there are a number of things, but the most important one is to have a kind of strategic plan about how you wish to distribute the pattern of economic development and growth going forward. And that's an infrastructure plan, that's a climate change plan, that's an industrial development and an economic development plan. The way we get these concentrations is by having particular poles of attraction. That's true of the San Francisco area, the Bay Area. It's true of the area around New York. And the way we got a diffused economy in the 20th century was by building an industrial base that was centered in the center of the country. So one can do that. I don't know that one can handle every neighborhood that way, and the kind of cheek by jowl, great wealth and great poverty. That's also a question of urban development, a question of patterns of taxation.
So, Professor, when you say a plan, a strategy, are you talking about a federal plan for economic development?
I think federal and regional plans, sure. I mean, to begin with, for example, think about the Tennessee Valley Authority, which had a transformational effect across the South and is partly responsible for the fact the South is no longer a left behind impoverished region. These things are very, very important. They can be done on a multi-state basis, but I think the federal government has to provide guidance.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Would any of the other witnesses like to address the question of geography? Yes, Professor Curry.
Yes, I just want to jump in and say, well, schools are an obvious place to start. They're very local. We know there's huge disparities. So targeting Title I schools, for example, would help to improve neighborhoods and stabilize them.
Yes, Ms. Barnes.
If I may as well, we know that the concentration of poverty in the southern states is higher than in other parts of the country. However, every state in the country has a large number of poor and low-wealth people in it. In your state, Congressman Hines, 38% of the people in Connecticut are poor or low income. So really, a regional plan, a federal plan must account for this vast and diffuse poverty as well as the concentrations of wealth that exist.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to tease out just in 1 or 2 remaining minutes a concept, again, that didn't come up too much in the initial testimony. We obviously have our political arguments, our policy arguments in this place. I think there's probably consensus that economic growth, setting aside fairness, economic growth is an important thing for the country. There's economic studies out there that show that we're at a point of disparity where our growth and productivity are being compromised. Mr. Furman, I wonder if you might just sort of give us a quick survey of the thinking in that regard and how much that might be damaging our economic growth.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a problem, which is that the pie is growing more slowly than it used to be, and the pie is getting increasingly unequally divided, and the combination of those two create an enormous hurdle for families trying to get ahead. Part of the source of that lower productivity growth is we're not making the types of investments we were making in the 1940s in fighting World War II, the 1950s with the interstate highway system, the 1960s with research and development. Part is that we're missing out on the potential of our people. The potential of our people is distributed equally based on gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera. The ability to express that based on the differences in school and the like that Professor Curry and many others have talked about are quite different. So we're missing out on a lot of our potential. We're not making the level of investments that we've made in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Furman. The gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Capter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and to our excellent witnesses, thank you for traveling here today. I would like to first ask unanimous consent to place a couple data sets in the record. One is a ranking of all members of Congress by the median household income of their congressional district. And since some of you are from universities, I would really love to have someone take this list and to look at it 30 years ago and to identify those districts that have fallen and those that have risen. As we look at the different regions of the country, I think, Dr. Galbraith, what you said about the change in the nature of the regional strength, economic strength of the country, and the lack thereof in many places can be ably demonstrated by a time series look at this data. So I would like to place that in the record along with a map indicating
Without objection, so ordered.
the graphing the country really in color to show where the hurt is the greatest and where we have had the greatest change. You referenced the industrial Midwest, which I represent a part of, and we have really, as have other areas, taken great blows. So I wanted to put that on the record. Also, I have a chart showing the state invention index, the number of patents filed in different regions, and the great disparity that has been created over the last 35 years in this area of innovation, which Speaker Pelosi often references. And finally, as a result of trade policy, since the 1980s, when I first arrived in Congress, the job loss by state, as a result of these policies, where we basically have been the victim of outsourcing. So I place those on the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very, very much. I have a theme. It isn't my own, but I adopted it from a man who comes from Chester, Pennsylvania, on the eastern side of Pennsylvania, an artist who represents Chester, and a community that has been badly impacted by changes in the economy. And his theme, a very positive theme, is what America makes and grows. Makes and grows America. I keep that in mind as I try to help my own region of the country, and as all of our members do. And I was interested, Dr. Galbraith, in your excellent summary, really, of what's happened in the last half century to the movement of capital and the resultant impact in different regions. In my part of the country, healthcare, which is not doesn't really create the greatest economic bang, has become the central employer in most cities. Most of those companies are so-called not-for-profit, although they basically move federal money through them in one way or another to keep them solvent. But they have become the major employers. And the companies that used to exist, which were industrial and agricultural, have largely outsourced. We have empty steel mills, we have empty auto factories, we have worried auto workers at the moment that the electric vehicle industry is going to create great displacement again, as there won't be replacement jobs. So my question to you really is, you mentioned Glass-Steagall. What can we do in terms of financial capital to make sure that there is fair investment across this country? What do you know from your experience? If I look at one of my greatest accomplishments is convincing people in my region to set up community development credit unions, so at least they have some capital to fix windows in their homes or to put a roof on their house, because so much capital has just been drained, right, Ms. Cheney? I can see you agreeing. Yes, the capital flight that has occurred is devastating. And so even to capture the wealth of Social Security checks and veterans payments and so forth, and checks that people earn, what can we do in the financial sector to have some accountability? The people that pay mortgages in my area, it's going to New York. Sorry to anyone from New York here. But to institutions that are based there rather than regionally. What can we do with this financial sector in order to get investment back in this country rather than being outsourced, that we can, again, make and grow America?
Well, I definitely agree, Congressman Capter, that the financial sector is oversized in this country, and it needs to have standards and models that function as for the purposes of economic development. I do think that your region of the country, and I started my career working for a legendary member of this House, Henry Royce of Milwaukee. I worked for a decade, so I knew something about this at the time. has an enormous potential, precisely because it's presently so run down and neglected, and that the future of the country will depend upon the ability to essentially rebalance things and to make things and make it into once more the vibrant region. This will not be similar to what it was in the 30s to the 70s.
The gentlelady's time
because
has
those
expired.
industries will not return.
Dr. Galbraith, big question. I just asked for you to elaborate on that answer for the record, please.
Right.
The gentlelady's time.
I will provide more for the records.
The gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you so much for referring to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where it's the center of my constituency, and I remember Henry Royce fondly. Mr. Gilbert, I may as well start with you, trying to understand and get some clarification about a couple of points you made in your testimony. You suggested that there are ways and means that we can recover from the technological outsourcing and so forth that we've experienced, where we have lost many jobs, quite frankly, in the Midwest. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. And also, how do we recover from the rents that people have achieved through, land grants and mineral rights and so on? How do we overcome that kind of inequitable distribution?
Okay, on that point, I think what you want to do is to ensure that people who own land are under considerable pressure to develop it and to put it to use so that it provides jobs and employment for the larger population. That is the purpose of orienting taxation toward that asset. It's an asset which can't escape taxation. It's much better to tax that than it is to tax working people's wages. And so when you do that, you're going to create an economy which is more balanced without necessarily directing what specific activities it's going to
That's
develop.
kind of a particular kind of wealth tax then.
Yeah, sure. A particular kind, an effective wealth tax, one you can actually appraise and levy. But then on top of that, I think we need to have a broader regional plan for redevelopment. And that's transportation, that's education, that's thinking about what kind of innovative industries you want to have, building on the strength that you mentioned of healthcare, for example. It's very important that these things can be developed into industries that are both regional, national, even global in their
Thank
scope.
you so much, sir. I would like to ask Professor Curry, you talked about children being at risk before birth. And we have policies in the country, welfare policies, quite frankly, where if you're poor, you have to go to work literally maybe even 6 weeks before, after giving birth. Do you have a construct or an age at which you think we ought to allow women to stay at home and nurture their children for their own well-being?
Well, a lot of other countries have more flexible maternity leave, so you can take a longer leave and you can take some of the leave before the birth and some of the leave after the birth, so that might be helpful. I do think that women should have more choice about whether they want to stay home and look after their kids, and that's a very important job for people and for the country. Some of these income supports might have some effect on having some women stay home and look after their kids instead of being in the labor force. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'll follow up with Jason Furman. I know you've done a lot of work on welfare reform. I think that's where I sort of know you from. And I thought about the high marginal tax rates that, primarily women who are on welfare face. And, this sort of pressure to work with these high marginal rates. Do you have any suggestions about sort of reform, and the whole narrative around, you're just, lazy and so forth, and you need to get to work? Do you have some notions of how we could reconfigure that policy?
So I think the child tax credit and making it fully available regardless of your income is incredibly important. One of the great steps this Congress has taken, and it should be made permanent. Additional support for child care, for preschool, for paid leave, all of these are investments in children. They enable more women, if they want to work and contribute to our economy in the market sense, or enable them to take care of their children and do that very important work. So I think those are some of the most important steps you could take.
Thank you so much. My time has expired.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Speaker Pelosi for assembling this very important committee, and thank you to the chairman and to all the panelists who are here with us today. I represent South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, a border region, and obviously one that a lot of us are familiar with because we see it on the news regularly, and we're familiar with the poverty and just international issues that happen in this area. And although the Rio Grande Valley is located at the southernmost part of our district, it has experienced years of economic and population and wage growth. We continue to be one of the poorest regions in the state and the county, and our potential seems to be limited because of interstate connectivity to the rest of the United States. We're the largest urban area in the country that lacks an interstate highway, and despite all this, the fact is we're over 200 miles from an interstate highway south of San Antonio. On top of the safety concerns and absence of this connection, the imperatives that we have that it brings to our local economy and trade and capacity and overall growth in Texas 15th District. We have $30 billion of trade that come through our international bridges, 650 million commercial vehicles annually. Most of this wealth does not stay in our region, it just comes through. We have some low-paying jobs and some average jobs. Very little of it is on the top end of the business sector. So for the panel, what type of economic impact does this lack of interstate connectivity have on a community like the Rio Grande Valley, in desperate need of both infrastructure expansion and enhancement? How does this geographic isolation and lack of interstate connectivity affect one of the nation's largest trading hubs adversely? That's to anyone who wants to take that question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the premise of your question. The United States needs substantially more infrastructure investments. You both get the direct jobs created in the course of building it, but much more important, you get an enduring expansion of the supply side of the economy, of our ability to produce, connecting more parts of our country, and strengthening jobs in places like South Texas.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
I have to say, whether in your community and others, communities of color know intimately what it means to be cut off, right? Whatever state you are within interstate. So we completely understand that and would agree with you that investments in lowering those barriers, ensuring that we are investing in communities that have previously been cut off is critically important, getting people back to work and investing in businesses, helping them to be able to bring business to them, as well as to be able to invest in broadband so that they are able to reach out beyond their communities is critically important.
Thank you. That's right. And that goes to my next question. This past year, many of us adjusted to working from home. Students attended virtual classes, and the consequences of unreliable internet access became more apparent than ever. Experts estimate more than 9 million Texans do not have broadband, either because of lack of infrastructure, infrastructure doesn't reach their homes, or because they don't subscribe to services because of their economic conditions. According to the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, in 2019, 4 of the 5 least connected cities in America were in Texas, 3 of them which were in the Rio Grande Valley. As you all know, broadband connectivity challenges are tied to income, creating a vicious cycle for unincorporated communities and families working to make ends meet. Now more than ever, we understand broadband is a necessity to economic growth and success. This question is for Professor Galbraith. How can we best identify economic impacts of the digital divide, and how can we address the needs to unincorporated in isolated communities such as the one I represent.
Thank you. This is the same problem that was faced in the 1930s with electricity and with telephone service, and the solution is to provide it as a public utility so that it's accessible to the whole population, and to do so in a way which provides for the basic services at a very minimal cost. And once that is done, it becomes basically like a road. You can access it without paying a user fee on a monthly basis, and at that point, the problem simply becomes one of getting the services out into the households that need it. So it is a problem, can be solved, but it needs to be addressed, and I think the same way that we solved those previous problems.
Mr. Gonzalez, I have to jump in. The National Urban League just put out a report this year called the Lewis-Latimer Plan for Digital Equity and Inclusion, and it is a comprehensive plan for closing the digital divide. And of course, one of the things that we have been calling for is investment in not only build-out, but also adoption measures, affordability measures to ensure that either when you get the broadband built out to you in rural communities, or if you're in urban communities right now with broadband all around you, but you cannot afford it, which is the vast majority of Americans who don't have broadband is because they can't afford it. I commend it to your reading, and I will submit it for the record.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
This gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been such an important beginning to this important work of the Select Committee. I've been thinking a lot about how the concept of democracy is at risk in so many ways, and I think it's at risk in part because there are people who would like democracy to fail, who question the worth of democracy, leading to the support of autocratic and corrupt leaders, and a question mark in the minds of low wealth and poor people and working people across this country that Congress, that government, that political leaders will actually stand up for them. And so in thinking about that, I think that one of the big reasons is this massive growth of inequality, this massive growth of concentration of wealth amongst a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of people. And the idea that really the American dream, which I benefited from in coming to this country by myself as an immigrant, doesn't exist for the vast majority of people. And so in that landscape, one of the things that I wanted to focus on is how we talk about and think about these measures of inequality. When we talk about poverty, and Ms. Barnes, your testimony was so compelling, thank you. It seems to me that we are excluding, even with the measures that we have, so many people. When we think about GDP, we are looking at a measure of economic growth that leaves out really the lives and livelihoods of people around the country that are suffering. So starting with Ms. Barnes, can you speak about the traditional measures of poverty and who we're leaving out? Is there a broader definition of poverty that the Select Committee should be using to start our investigation?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman Jayapal. There are many faults and limitations of the traditional measures of poverty, whether it's the official poverty measure or the supplemental poverty measure. And just to say briefly, the poverty threshold is less than $13,000 for an individual and about $27,000 for a family of four, which is far below the cost of living. And so what we have done in the Poor People's Campaign and what we would recommend is to double that. So at least you're still below the median income. You're looking at an average household income about $50,000, but we believe it's a better approximation of the scale of poverty and economic insecurity, because when you aren't measuring these things right, none of the federal programs that would be implemented can meet the need. And in fact, the definition that currently exists has been used by some members of Congress to justify keeping the minimum wage what it is, not raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, saying that, $10 or $11 would maintain people above the poverty line, but it is so inadequate. We actually need a broader definition to capture that full extent.
And Professor Galbraith, what about GDP? We constantly use GDP, but if you look at the 1980s, there was a very different distribution of where the profits went to in terms of the entire population versus where it is today. What do we do about how we look at economic growth and whether we're successful or not?
The GDP measure was created in the last century partly to help manage the mobilization for World War II, and it's a measure that doesn't care about disparity. A dollar going to a wealthy person is the same as a dollar going to a poorer person. And that's basically, it's not the appropriate measure. Growth is a traditional value, if you like, at this point, but we have to redefine it so that we are achieving, let's say, a broader sense of common welfare. When we have extreme poles of wealth, you're creating enormous stress on the less well-advantaged people who then have longer commutes and who are, in other ways, basically excluded from living near where they work because you've got these poles of disparity. That is something which can be dealt with by essentially effective planning and effective taxation. So you have to have provisions that reduce the stress on people and make their lives essentially stable and secure. And another thing about this is that GDP doesn't care about how secure you are. GDP is a measure at a given moment. It doesn't tell you whether your job is secure, whether your retirement is secure, whether your health care is secure. And you can measure that and add that in as a kind of the set of social objectives that you're trying to deal with.
I have 20 seconds left, but you mentioned lowering the Medicare eligibility age, and I wanted to ask you why you mentioned that as part of addressing income inequality.
Because it's an incremental step that could be done, I think, reasonably quickly, and because it would relieve healthcare pressure on a segment of the population, 55 to 65, that has more healthcare problems, and therefore it would reduce the burden on private insurance as well. So if you can't get Medicare for all, which I would favor, I'm in favor of I'm a half a loaf person. It's better than none.
You said that just for me. I know you did. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for the too loud sounds over here, but it's appropriate that I hit SOS call down here on my phone on accident because I do think that this is a major priority and emergency for the United States. Thanks so much to Speaker Pelosi for putting us here, bringing us together. You know, I've only been here one term, but my observation is that far too many times we rush to conclusions without listening to try to redefine the issues. The rampant economic disparity, this wealth gap we have in this country, it's an immense challenge. It's a generational challenge. It demands our full attention and really a willingness to think creatively about how we address these facts. You know, the Select Committee here is really decades overdue. It's been more than 50 years since President Johnson's Commission on Rural Poverty published its report on the people left behind. My role on this committee is to focus on how do we help family farmers, ensuring a food supply chain for Americans for years to come, and how do we help rural communities across our nation? And we know that this has proved to be such a challenge for this nation. You know, the numbers bear it out. It's also anecdotally true. I represent Minnesota's 2nd District, but you can tell from my accent, maybe I come from a little further south. I grew up in rural Arkansas. You know, our own personal story was that my mom worked 2 jobs, went to school for most of my childhood. She drove 40 miles each way to go to school. She was privileged. She had a car. She could make that transition in life. She could reach up, go to college, become a teacher over 9 years, and work to extend that hand to her 3 kids. My grandfather was a farm foreman before the 1980s farm crisis drove him out. Earlier this month, I visited my family in rural Arkansas, and I was really struck that the grain bins in the center of town are empty, vacant lots are everywhere, and young folks have moved on. I share this anecdote not because it's a universal stand-in for the problems that we face, but because it's just a small snapshot that helps me better frame the challenge that we're tackling and the challenge that's been so perplexing as a nation. And we know that the highest poverty rates in this nation are actually Black and Hispanic Americans living in rural America. This is such a geographic issue as well. So improving these economic conditions is really no small task. This nation has not been able to figure it out. I hope that we are joined by some of my Republican colleagues in the future. I hope my optimism that we will be joined by them is not misplaced, because I know so many of those colleagues care deeply about rural communities as well across our nation. So thank you so much to our witnesses today. I'm going to pose my first question to Professor Curry, and then I'd like in our second round just to kind of ask you all, if you were framing where you think we need to look in rural communities across this country, how would you frame that for us and have us explore? So Professor Curry, the trends that we see there, education gaps, the graying of our communities, are there any trends that are particularly significant to you in any of the data? And how might this issue be impacted, either positively or negatively, by the increased reliance on virtual learning during the pandemic? Are there any bright sides to what we just went through for rural communities as we look at closing the education gap?
That's a great question, actually. One real bright spot, which maybe we can learn something from, has been telemedicine, which has been huge in rural areas, and particularly the ability to get mental health care remotely. And there's a number of communities that have pioneered making those kind of facilities available, and the changes in the coverage of that with insurance and so on really helped. I don't think we've seen quite as much innovation yet in education, but it really does point to a possible way forward if we can solve these problems with things like broadband access to allow rural communities to participate.
Thank you, Professor Curry. And we know this challenge is large. Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up, so I yield back, but look forward to our second round.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Himes, for facilitating and calling in such wonderful witnesses, and thank you to our speaker for having the foresight and placing the value and importance in the threat that inequality poses to the stability of a prosperous American society. Dr. Furman had said something at the beginning of his testimony that I think is just so worth repeating, which is that from 1948 to 1973, the typical American family saw their income double about once every 23 years. So if you work an entire career, you can see yourself actually step up in your social class in your lifetime. You can go from an apartment to a home, to have your children go to a good school. And since 1973, the rate that it takes to double your income will now take over 100 years. So a family's income will not double in their lifetime or in one working generation, but 3 or 4 working generations, not once in one generation or once in one lifetime, but once in a century. And that declination of growth and prosperity is an absolute threat. But income inequality is not just growing. Historically, it has been accelerating. Is that true, Professor Galbraith?
With some ups and downs, yes.
And so one of my questions here is that in that acceleration, we're seeing developments, that would mean that acceleration means these developments in inequality start happening in a more concentrated period of time more recently. And I'm interested, one of the things that I'm charged with in this committee is really digging into some of the generational aspects in how inequality is manifesting today. And I'm interested if there are certain key basic building blocks to an American way of life, whether it's education, the home you live in, the water that you're drinking, the way your community is organized. If there are certain of those emerging challenges, what is much harder now that was perhaps easier for the American family to do about 50 years ago that we should really be examining as a committee?
Well, I think many of the things you're mentioning will not factor into income specifically, but into the quality of life that our communities are able to experience. And that was something, a major project of construction in the 20th century. It got us Social Security. It got us essentially upgraded. It got us housing that was upgraded that people could live in. It got us an educational system that was broadly accessible to the population. All of these things add in to the general quality of life. When you've taken care of those, and then you'll moderate the growth of earnings. You're not going to prevent accumulations. You're not going to prevent some people from getting rich. You wouldn't want to. But you can, of course, work to prevent them from passing it on. Encourage philanthropy and basically tax estates. And then you ensure that you're kind of renewing the republic at each generation. That's the way I tend to think about it. The rise of inequality is a specific historical period. It starts in the late 1970s. It really it reaches a peak around 2000. After that, it's a series of ups and downs in my measures. We're still at a very, very high level. But it wasn't always like that, and it doesn't have to be like that. And there's living memory of how it can be moderated and brought back into essentially a sustainable community.
Thank you.
I just want to jump in with one word: education.
Thank you, Professor Curie. And to follow up on that, I think one of the things that I'm so appreciative about the disposition of this committee is that it is investigatory. And we're not coming to the table, trying to prove a predetermined point, but truly investigate what are some of the areas that are most effective to narrow in on. And so as a general question to the overall committee, if you were to determine what success would look like for this committee, what we can walk away from in terms of what we investigate or what measures we could perhaps determine, suggestions, what would that look like to you in terms of what would be a successful endeavor within the scope of this committee?
Hi, this is Joy. I will weigh in for the National Urban League. I would love to see you all really invest in where we're putting our investments around minority-owned businesses, allowing people to invest in themselves and in their communities, to hire, to grow from being solo proprietors, maybe only having one employee, to having multiple employees, to be able to benefit from all the infrastructure investments that we are having. That would happen regionally, to Congresswoman Craig's point and others, and that would have regional impact, and that would have generational impact, because young people are overwhelmingly entrepreneurial, but they also do not have access to capital. And so I'd love to see the committee really do an assessment of what is happening with minority-owned firms and how we can invest in them.
I might just jump in for 1 minute. Apologies.
I'm sorry, Ms. We're way past time on this question, but I do intend, by the way, just so the witnesses know, after Ms. Jacobs, we'll take a 5-minute recess because we've been here for a little while, but then I'm going to offer the members an additional 4 minutes of question time, so we can come back to that. With that, the gentlewoman from Ms. Jacobs is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses, not only for being here and talking to us, but also for all of your great work. I know it often might feel like you're toiling in the darkness and no one is watching all the work you're doing, but we really do appreciate it, and I'm glad we're able to shine a light on it today. And to the speaker for creating this committee, for really elevating this important issue, which I think is the central issue of our time, and also for appointing me to this committee. I'm the freshman on the committee, but in addition to that, I have a very different experience with inequality. I benefited from it. I am the beneficiary of this very unfair system. And I think if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were here, they would be spending a lot of time talking about merit and why it's okay we have this inequality because of merit. But what I did to inherit my wealth was that I was born. That's what I did to earn it. And so I think that's important when we're talking about this issue, that the people who are experiencing poverty, the people who are experiencing stagnation in growth, they didn't create this problem. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, and especially those of us who benefited from this system, to make sure that we're partners in the solution and that we're working together to try and solve it. So I wanted to get to my question, which is, a lot of what you all have talked about has been incredibly interesting and important, and exactly what we're working on right now with the infrastructure bill and the American Families and Jobs Plan. And so what I'd like us to do is maybe a thought experiment, and Mr. Furman, I'll start with you. Let's fast forward 2 years. We've passed everything we want in the bipartisan infrastructure plan. We've passed the families plan, the jobs plan. We've expanded the child tax credit, invested hundreds of billions of dollars in universal pre-K, in childcare. What will inequality look like then? What will be the next phase of inequality that we should be thinking about after we get done all of these priorities that we're working on right now?
So, some steps will happen very quickly. If you raise the minimum wage, I know it's not part of either of those plans, that would instantly make a big difference. Some things like education partly help right away because they help parents and enable them to work, but a lot of the benefits of preschool you won't see until 20 or 30 years from now. There's virtually nothing in the president's plans that I looked at and thought, that could, that needed to be smaller. There were a lot I looked at and said, you could do even more. You could come back and invest more in preschool. You could have more generous paid leave. It's all a really, really great start, but it's definitely not an end and won't fully solve all these problems.
Well, thank you. And Professor Curry, I was hoping if we do all these things we want on children's issues, what will the state of childhood poverty look like? And what will be the child tax credit expanded cuts childhood poverty in half? What next do we need to do to get to that second half?
This hasn't come up at all. And I'm just going to say doing something about the carceral state. So the fact that so many children have parents who are in jail, and then once the parents are in jail, they can't get a job. And that's a really huge issue, which hasn't been mentioned.
No, I appreciate that. I'm going to go to my next question, but I will turn to you for it, which is, we've talked a lot about what got us here, what factors have created the inequality that we're experiencing right now. And I guess I'm wondering if you all think that the factors that are going to create inequality in the future are the same as the ones that have gotten us here, and how new technologies will affect this inequality. And also, Dr. Furman, in your testimony, you talked about less work and productivity decreasing. As we continue to see productivity and labor diverge in the future, or I guess do you believe they'll continue to diverge in the future, what do you believe that means for drivers of inequality? So I'll start with you, Ms. Barnes, since I know you had something to say, and then hopefully we'll have time for Mr. Furman too.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I just wanted to say one thing about your earlier question to Professor Curry. In terms of getting to the other half, we have to be very careful again about how we're quantifying the effects of these measures. Moving people above what is really an inadequate poverty line doesn't actually cut poverty in half. And so I just wanted to put that out for the record. In terms of the effects of what we could see going forward, I think it's helpful to go a little bit further back, or not too far back, but about a decade back to the recovery from the 2008 economic crisis, which was in large part a low-wage recovery. Middle-income jobs were lost. They were replaced by low-income jobs, and that has led to this proliferation of the inability to meet basic needs. And so, moving towards, if we're able to establish, whether it's through the child tax credit, whether it's through the expansion of some of these social welfare programs, whether it's through, I hope, the expansion or the raising of the minimum wage, we have to get to this point where you're not just, providing people a baseline for which, to survive, but where we can actually thrive. And that means ensuring that the costs of living do not actually outpace the incomes and the resources that people have access to.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. I did note the conversation has been terrific. Pretty much every member came up against the 5-minute limit of their time. So I'm going to have a precisely 5-minute recess so that you can stretch your legs and use the facilities if you want. Then we will have a second round in which each member will have 4 minutes to follow up on any questions by order of seniority. I'll go from being strict on the gavel to being ruthless on the gavel so that we keep control. But as of now, we will stand in recess for 5 minutes and gavel in precisely 5 minutes. Let me ask the witnesses to please retake their seats. The committee will come back to order for our second and final round of 4-minute questions from each member. I thank the witnesses again. I'd like to recognize myself for 4 minutes and ask just one question. Professor Curry, you gave a one-word answer: education. There's a running debate around the effects of globalization, trade, automation. All of these things, of course, create what the economists euphemistically call dislocation. I don't want to focus on pre-K or early education or traditional education. I want to focus on something that I feel we don't do nearly well enough, which is job retraining as a solution to dislocation. So kind of a jump ball for whatever witness would like to say to speak on the topic, but what can we do more and better around retraining people whose jobs have disappeared as a result of either automation, globalization, whatever it may be?
Well, I'll jump in and say that the National Urban League, one of our largest programs is around workforce development. And we focus a great deal also on reentry programs. And so we were thrilled originally to see $100 billion in workforce development in the Biden plan, and then we're a little concerned that we're not seeing it, and we hope that it gets in reconciliation or some other way, because it is so important, and it invests in third-party intermediaries who provide that direct, services, and are looking at people who have been displaced, who need to figure out how to get online, to be retrained, who may have had been incarcerated or are looking to reenter the workforce and need to have those types of services. And we know the community because, of course, we're in the community at 91 affiliates across the country. So that is what we'd love to see, some investment in workforce development.
Professor Goldberg?
Yeah, I would say that the most important thing about training is training that occurs on the job, and this gets to the suggestion that I had that you investigate the prospect of a job guarantee. As people are working, that gives them the experience that they need in order to move on to better jobs. If their experience is broken, if they're spending time unemployed, if they're looking for jobs, that basically is a big gap in the CV, a big gap in the resume. It makes it very difficult to continue. Mm-hmm. So people who want to work, if you can provide work for them, that will be perhaps the most important single thing I think you can do.
Also, community college. So a lot of people can get retrained relatively quickly in a community college program, and so that's worth looking into.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts from the witnesses in my remaining minute?
I would just say unemployment insurance, I think, is in need of a permanent reform, not just the problems that are going to happen on September 6th when people are cut off, but the coverage of it has become too low. It can incorporate more to help people stay in jobs and retraining and job search assistance. So I think a real modernization and reform of that program would be very helpful, including in this area.
Thank you. Professor Galbraith, in my remaining time, let me push you on your on-the-job training point. I think it's important, but what's the value of on-the-job training at the steel mill that's about to close? How do you square that circle?
Most of those jobs are not going to be in steel mills. The jobs that you want that people are going to work the workforce.
You're going to need to turn on your mic.
The jobs of today's workforce are often service jobs, or often office jobs. They're jobs. They're not going to be very many jobs in steel mills. In fact, as we get advanced manufacturing, it takes less labor. But that doesn't mean you can't have good work for people. Well, my point is that if you're basically trying to get people into the workforce in a way which is effective for them, providing them with jobs is probably the most successful way, because that gives them employment experience that other employers, that private employers who are offering better jobs will value. And employers like to hire people who are already working and who can show that they have a record of it.
Thank you, Professor, and I yield back the balance of my time. Ms. Capter for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My fundamental question for the witnesses is, could you now, or for the record, recommend how to reinvest capital in this country in depleted regions? The Speaker Pelosi referenced a term, the immorality of wealth disparity, and I completely agree with her as I see wealth drawn away from the communities that I represent, the wealth that remains, but it's gone to the coasts, to some of the institutions that you have referenced, and I've noticed the rise of speculation and the great financial engineering that just sucks wealth. In a community like I represent, it isn't Genoa Bank from Ohio that paid for the outsourcing of Dura Corporation from Toledo, Ohio, to a maquiladora in Mexico where people work for slave labor, really. But I've seen this happen time and time and time again, to a point that it is actually frightening to watch our ability to make and to grow diminish. I hear Angie Craig talk about rural America. Well, if you look at the level of food imports, you're asking yourself the question, what's wrong here? Why is the average age of farmers 64 or 65 years old? Where are we going to get the next generation of farmers? I got ideas on that. However, what's happening with the management of capital, in my opinion, in this country is an immorality, a huge one. I agree with the speaker there. And we have to address that because we can't pay for education. Redistribution of wealth alone, without holding capital accountable, will not solve our problems. It won't solve education, it won't solve childcare, it will not raise the minimum wage if you look at what's happening in this country. So we have to look at what Henry Royce used to look at, and what William Proxmire used to look at. We have to look at what's happening to capital in this country, and we have to hold it accountable. One figure I have, when Sears and Kmart merged, one hedge fund guy on the East Coast made $1.02 billion from that alone. Wow. Bring that to my district. Help me out. But I think this issue of your recommendations on what we could do with capital for reinvestment in depleted regions would be one of the most important sets of recommendations you could make to us. Do you have any comment on that? That's my only question.
I have one comment, which is that you might amend your motto to make, to grow, and to serve. Because, as Professor Galbraith said, jobs in healthcare, jobs in education, a lot of those are good jobs, and that's where the growth is. The growth is not going to be in manufacturing going forward. So we need to think about investing in those kinds of things. So it may be a good thing that in your district you have a lot of healthcare. And those are the services that people want.
It doesn't create wealth, ma'am, at the rate that the other sectors have. That's one of the issues. If one looks at healthcare, it's largely redistributive. Probably the most important thing we can do is pass an infrastructure bill if you want to look at real wealth creation because of the assets you create. But healthcare is, if you look at where the money comes from, it's largely public, right? You're not growing you're not growing the wealth, you're spreading it around.
50% is public.
Yes, it's huge.
My experience living in Austin is that industries locate where people want to live. Rebuild the region, and the businesses will come. That's if you have the places that people wish to live, that are great places to live, then you will bring and private capital will come in rather than go out. And so essentially it's laying down the basis for it that is the essential task.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Moore is recognized for 4 minutes.
I hope I can get all this in 4 minutes. I was around in 2007 when Henry Paulson came in and said we need $900 billion, else the economy is going to collapse. And my initial response was, oh, hell no. But I saw that they were absolutely true. I guess the question that I have, maybe to Ms. Cheney, maybe to Professor Galbraith, is that the biggest transfer of wealth, I guess, from the federal government to individual people has been through housing programs. And what have we gotten out of these big, huge things, redlining, blockbusting, gentrification, the mortgage crisis, which targeted poor people. And then when we gave this money up, the bailouts did not go to individual homeowners. I think African Americans lost more wealth during that time than in a long time. How can we continue to support homeownership, which is the pathway to wealth creation, and avoid these racialized outcomes? That's one question I have. Another question that I might have is, the risk of not addressing inequality. I think people think, and I think you made the point, they think it's okay if I'm rich and you're not. But I want you to share with us what the risks are of not addressing this, the risk to people who have money. And I would yield to you for these answers.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, just this year, Black home ownership is at 44.6%, white home ownership at 74.2%. You cannot have wealth creation when you have that kind of disparity. One of the things that the National Urban League we would like to see is us cracking down on discrimination in terms of lending. We want to look at home valuation of property that people do own, but we also want to look at providing rental assistance. We know that that type of direct assistance, people want to purchase homes. They understand that that is what gives them the greatest amount of generational wealth, not just about income, about having property and something that they can pass on to the next generation. So those are the types of things that we are looking at. Down payment assistance would certainly be at the top of that list.
Your thoughts, Professor Gilruth?
There was a massive abuse of the home ownership program of the mortgage industry, and we failed in the aftermath of the crisis to deal with it, and there was a further set of abuses with the foreclosure crisis that followed on. Going forward, we need to have a simple system that works for people, and that is where we have effective regulation of the financial sector's interaction with home ownership and home financing, so as to prevent these things from happening again, and so as to essentially restore a basis for long-term servicing of basically reasonable mortgages.
Thank you. And I just want to see what the panelists think about the notion that, the couple of times in history, the Great Recession, the Great Depression, it was when income inequality was at its greatest. And so I just wonder if you all think that the risk of not dealing with it is economic collapse of our entire economy.
Yes.
Yes? What do you
Yes.
think, Ms. Barnes?
Yes, I mean, this is what we've been, we're headed toward this cliff. We cannot sustain this level of inequality when the fundamental, not only the middle is falling out, but the bottom is eroding. And, as I said earlier, poor and low-income people don't run this country, but they make it run. If they are struggling with debt, with suicide, with health crises, with emotional crises, with the constant struggle of not being able to meet your needs in every day, then we have no economy from here on out.
Thank you for your...
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to address another question, and I refer back to my district in the Rio Grande Valley, but obviously there's many places around the country that are similar. The Rio Grande Valley, with over 98% of its population identifying as Hispanic or Latino, is also faced with almost double the rate of uninsured as the rest of the state of Texas, home to double the uninsured rate of the country. With less access to health care, South Texans are also faced with higher incidence of chronic conditions such as adult and adolescent diabetes and obesity. These conditions and health care costs associated with them exacerbate health and financial burdens placed on South Texans, impacting our wallets, health, and opportunities. Professor Curry, would you speak to the complex relationship between income, race, and health disparities and how we saw these interrelated factors impact communities during this COVID-19 pandemic? My district, for example, is actually the Rio Grande is 4% of the state population, but we represent more than double of the mortality rates because of COVID around the state. So we represented, I think, almost 10% of the deaths in Texas. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, another thing I guess that hasn't come up very much is immigration and responses to immigration. And one of the things that we saw in the years leading up to the pandemic was a lot of people who were eligible for health insurance but didn't use health insurance because they were afraid that it might have immigration consequences. So, for example, immigrant parents with U.S. citizen children and the U.S. citizen children not being enrolled in Medicaid because the parents were afraid that that might lead to immigration problems. So, that's an important issue. Another important issue, which hasn't gotten very much attention and is true in Texas, Texas saw a big decline in Medicaid enrollments among children after 2016, which seemed to be largely due to administrative barriers to people signing up. There was no change in the income limit, but it was just made more difficult. And those kinds of barriers really matter to the administration of programs and resulted in a lot more people being uninsured.
Thank you. Yes, and at the height of COVID in my district, our hospitals were at full capacity. People were dying outside of the hospitals in ambulances. They became virtual hospital rooms, if you will. We had 4 freezer trucks in the Rio Grande Valley. As you can imagine, with collecting cadavers, it took us 20 or 30 days to have a decent funeral. But at the height of it, we had a shortage of even oxygen, not only PPE and everything. And what could we do with international vendors that were distributing oxygen to hospitals around the country? But it seemed like our region was the last to receive the just essential necessary items as oxygen, PPE, equipment for our local physicians and healthcare providers. And I didn't see that disparity in other parts. I called friends in Houston and Dallas and other parts of the state, and they were also going through a very complicated time. But it seemed like regions like ours were at the end of at the back of the bus and were ignored. And certainly rules need to be put in place to assure that never happens again.
Well, COVID really laid bare the sort of lack of emergency preparedness for something like that, right? So I think across the country, public health units have been understaffed, underfunded, so people know what needs to be done, but they don't have the resources to do it. Unless we do something about that, that's going to happen again the next time that we have something like COVID-19 come along.
I think especially
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jayapal is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I read a stunning report in the Washington Post, I think just 2 days ago, that said that our tremendous efforts with the American Rescue Plan, and they specifically mentioned survival checks, unemployment insurance, and food stamps, cut poverty to the lowest level on record, illuminating, I think, what Ms. Barnes has been saying, that poverty is a choice. It's a bad choice, but it's a choice. And I want to be clear that I understand that poverty, as we define it, is not sufficient. So this is outside of that. But it leads me to 2 questions. One about the social safety net and how we think about what the social safety net should be and why it's important as we look at the work of this committee. And then secondly, how to set standards for jobs, because we have this dramatic increase in working poor who are working full-time, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, and unable to pay for the very basics. And I'll give you one example. I have a very large employer called Amazon in my district, headquartered in my district, and every time we talk about jobs coming to the district or to the state, what we don't talk about is how many of those jobs still require public assistance for people to be able to get their social safety nets, the things that they really need. So Amazon is one of the top 10 employers that has the most number of workers, Amazon workers, on state Medicaid. So how can we redefine what we think of as a good job, so that when we talk about bringing jobs to a district, whether it's Representative Capter's district or my district, we are talking about basic standards that allow those workers to make it every day. So anybody want to take on both how to set standards for jobs and then also, and redefine the way we think about jobs, and then also this question of the role of the safety net and how important it is in addressing inequality?
If I may, I may just say a word on the social safety net and how it was established established and expanded during moments of crisis in this country, whether it was from the Great Depression and the fallout from there, or in the expansion that happened under the Johnson administration with the War on Poverty programs. You know, there are moments of crisis in history that demand the expansion of these programs, that demand the establishment of new programs to meet the need at hand. And I think that's the kind of moment we're in today. We're seeing the baby steps of going in that direction, whether it's the expansion of the child tax credit, where it's the temporary expansion of unemployment. All of these things are indicating some of the trends that Professor Galbraith and others have spoken to that have been evolving for 50 years and actually are calling for the fundamental restructuring of the social safety net for these times. And that has to work, like you're saying, Congresswoman, in conjunction with the jobs that are available. So meeting that guarantee, whether it's through a standard, the level of wages that have to be established, the level of job protections that have to be guaranteed through unemployment, paid family medical leave, et cetera, or the establishment of something like a guaranteed income, which would establish a floor beyond which nothing else, it would raise the floor in this time to expand the safety net as it has been before.
Thank you. Mr. Galbraith?
Just maybe pose a rhetorical question. It was quite stunning to me. How is it that a corporation that is as large, as successful as Amazon does not provide employer-paid health insurance for all of its workers?
Well, thank you for that question. It leads to my next question, which is about consolidation, market consolidation and concentration, monopoly powers of many of these companies. And Mr. Furman, I have just a few seconds, but if you would comment on that and its relationship to inequality.
Yeah, I think concentration is an area that has hurt economic growth because you need competition for growth, and hurt inequality as powerful employers can reduce wages, and so reinvigorated antitrust and approach to competition like the administration has proposed in their executive order, I think would be very helpful in that regard.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to try something a little bit different, a lightning round to each of you. So here's the question. Where do you believe the select committee should focus if we want to make a dent in improving economic disparity in rural America? Mr. Furman.
If you could pick one, I'd pick children, but there's no magic bullet, so don't just do one thing.
All right, Ms. Cheney.
Invest in women and invest in entrepreneurship.
Mr. Galbraith.
I would anchor the communities with good health care, good education, and good services. Let people want to come to them.
Professor Curry.
Agree with Professor Galbraith, and I'll leave it at that.
Ms. Barnes.
I would also add, to what's been said on addressing the crisis of water and sanitation and access to clean air, clean land, as a way to revitalize and revive some of our rural communities.
Great. Second question. You didn't know there was another round, did you? Second question is, how are we going to get these young people back to the communities? The graying of America in rural communities has been a real challenge. Mr. Furman, how do we do that? Ms. Cheney.
Infrastructure, transportation, and making sure they have broadband there.
Professor Galbraith. Professor Curry.
Broadband, education, health.
Ms. Barnes.
Yes, everything that's been said, and then also ensuring that there is community centers, places, institutions that can actually hold and develop the youth that we have today.
I'm so impressed with all of you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I am going to yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Minnesota, unprecedented yielding back. Thank you. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez for 4 minutes.
Thank you so much. And it is indeed unprecedented in institutions like ours, so thank you. Ms. Barnes, you had mentioned something earlier that I wanted to make sure we revisited, which was how we measure poverty in the United States. This is a measure that is almost notoriously been obsolete. The original calculation of the poverty line in the United States is essentially 3 times whatever the cost of the basic nutritional requirement was in 1963. And that is then adjusted for family size and slightly for inflation, but we are largely rooted and anchored in that original calculation. 1963, that assumes largely one breadwinner in the home. It assumes no cost of childcare. It was before many of the common utilities, what we consider utilities now, like the internet, even existed. And so my question to you is, we cannot fix what we cannot measure. We cannot know if we are being successful or not with such obsolete measures. So what, if you could calculate a poverty line today, what would be some of those key inputs, and how would you determine what do you think should go into a modern measure of a poverty line?
Thank you for this question. What should go into the poverty line would include some of the costs of living that have outpaced the cost of income over the past 60 years. So this is the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing, the cost of education, of childcare, of transportation, of basic utilities. I would also include in some way to account for the debt burdens that households are facing unequally across race, of course. And so all of these factors are currently inadequately included in the measure of poverty. And what that does is, as you've said, and I would rely on the wisdom of Reverend Dr. King, as he was organizing the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, he said the prescription for the cure rests with an accurate diagnosis of the disease. And unless we understand these conditions, unless we have this full picture, there's no way that we are going to be able to actually repair the deep breaches in our society.
Thank you. And going further on that, we cannot fix what we cannot measure. So I pose this question to all of our witnesses. Are there existing measures? Are there new measures that we should be determining? Are there current measures that are obsolete, like the poverty line, that the federal government should be examining and updating? And are there measures that we currently have that are being underlooked in our determination of success? Just as Bobby Kennedy said decades ago, this is not just about GDP, but actual well-being. Professor Curry.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. I serve on the Committee on National Statistics for the National Academy of Sciences, and they have a committee that's looking into better measures of poverty right now. The supplemental poverty measure that the census already puts out is a much better measure because it does include things like housing. It does not include the value of medical care, which is a big problem, and so there's quite a lot of discussion about how that could be appropriately incorporated. So I would say take a look at the supplemental poverty measure instead of the traditional poverty measure. I mean, one problem with the traditional poverty measure is it doesn't include the value of any federal programs. So by definition, none of the federal programs for poor people can have any effect on poverty because they're not included in the poverty measure, right?
Thank you, Professor.
Exactly what I was going to say. You want to document the extent of the problem. You also want to understand how your programs are helping to solve the problem. And so if you look at a poverty measure that doesn't include SNAP benefits, that doesn't include the earned income tax credit, you'll miss out on what you're doing to actually lower it, for example, in the Rescue Plan and the CARES Act, and what that was reflected in the New York Times story.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Last but certainly not least, 4 minutes for the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs.
Well, thank you. I ended my last set of questions with a question we didn't get to. So, Mr. Furman, I was hoping you could talk a little bit, maybe all of you, if you have thoughts on how technology is going to change what the drivers of inequality in the future will be, or maybe it won't. Maybe this is just a cycle we see and we just have recency bias.
So and to get to the question you asked at the end last time, the norm for most countries for most times is that when productivity goes up by 10%, that what typical workers get paid also goes up by 10%. What we've had in the United States over the last 40 years is abnormal, where those two have been disconnected. It's hard to predict who's going to benefit from technology because we've had a lot of technological progress in the past that really has benefited people. So I'd root for the most technological progress we've had. What we can control more, though, is who's in a position to benefit from that, especially through education. So if more people get more education, you do things to enable, preschool for everyone, to make college affordable, and the like, that's going to be more of the guarantee that people can take advantage of those technological changes.
Thank you. And then, we talked a lot about the family income over the last 100 years versus 20 years. I think we talked about how we're measuring poverty as a level of income. And I think we have a lot of solutions for how you address income and wages. But in many ways, the wealth gap is actually more staggering than the income gap. And if you look at someone like Jeff Bezos, if we want to keep on the Amazon train, right? I think his salary was $81,840 a year. After you add additional compensation, it totaled $1.7 million, but he's worth $211 billion. So income isn't actually the question we're working with here. And I know we talked a bit about home ownership. I think we all know that's a big component of it, but I was just wondering if any of you have other thoughts on how we can be thinking about this question of wealth rather than income as we're looking at inequality, and how we address wealth inequality without disincentivizing innovation, which is, I think, what we often hear when asked about this question. Whoever.
If I may jump in quickly, one thing I would encourage the committee to look at is not just individual wealth, but community-based wealth, and access to drivers of wealth, whether that is natural resources, educational institutions, other social institutions that encourage the development of wealth across generations.
Also, part of the answer is, if you raise taxes on corporations, including on their overseas earnings, raise capital gains, and also tax capital gains at death, some of that is, as Professor Galbraith was saying, is taxing rent, sort of the extra profits above and beyond that you were getting. And if you lose some of your rents, you're sort of sad as a company, but you still are getting quite a lot and have quite a lot of incentive to invest. The Tax Foundation is a very conservative think tank. They analyzed President Biden's capital gains tax proposal. I think they said it would lower economic growth by like 0.001% or some number, like minuscule number, and they hate the proposal. And that's all they could come up with. So I think those types of proposals would do very, very little to discourage innovation and a lot to create resources that could be better used.
And I would just bear in mind that the social insurance programs are a form of wealth. And as you expand them, you're expanding everybody's wealth, not necessarily showing up in any individual's balance sheet, but it's nevertheless serving exactly the same function. And that's an important basis of society.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. I would like to thank, first and most importantly, the Speaker of the House, who conceived of this committee, brought it to life, and who has honored us with her presence for the entire 2-hour inaugural meeting of this committee. And I'm getting indicated, I'll recognize the Speaker.
You for this very productive hearing. I'm injecting myself into it. I had not intended to, but I just want to make a couple of observations. First of all, the time of the speaker is in great demand, and people always say to me, how can I get that time? The 2 hours I spent here for me was so valuable and so necessary, because this not only undermines who we are as a people, it completely threatens our democracy. So we don't have any more important work to do than what we're focusing on here. Now, I will say that what's important, because as we listen to the testimony, and hasn't it been excellent? I'm so proud of the questions and informed by the answers. Understand that our committees of jurisdiction are having similar hearings on one subject or another. What the value of this is the aggregation the aggregation of it. It's not this happened over there, last 2 months ago this happened. The aggregation of it. And so the responsibility of the committee to come up with solutions after a well-defined diagnosis of the problem. I have something that I want to say about location, Marcy, because with all the respect to Dr. Galbraith, people like to go where they like to live. We have to make environments desirable. As I've traveled the country in many of your districts, I've seen, follow the children. People will go where their children can have a good education, access to health care, and decent housing. And part of that is the connectivity of it. Can't afford to live in San Francisco, but if we had, all of us had better mass transit and connectivity, even to bigger highways, et cetera, people could afford to live in a better way farther from the workplace because of the mobility that would cause. As far as the social net, what I think about the safety net is it's a safety net for workers and families. It is a safety net for corporate America. It enables them to make decisions that are not really in everyone's interest. They benefit from all of these things. It's a corporate safety net. I've always thought that for a long time because it gives them so much flexibility to well, in all fairness and respect for the private sector, to survive in cycles that come and go for their prosperity. But it is a decision. They make decisions in a way because we, the taxpayer, the American people, are giving them the safety social net to do that. And in any event, I had some more things, but I do think the time has come to not lose the impact of the beautiful testimony that we heard today. Really hopeful because of the commitment of our members and the array of concerns that you have raised, but in understanding that the one thing that you have that none of the other committees have is the aggregation of it all, and therefore the responsibility as we go forward for solutions. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our very excellent guest witnesses and to our members. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the committee is profoundly grateful for your commitment and investment of time this morning in our inaugural hearing. The chair would also like to thank the witnesses for participating and for a fabulous conversation, and we hope to continue this conversation over the lifetime of this committee and the remainder of this Congress. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email addresses provided to your offices, and I thank the witnesses again for your testimony and for participating today. This hearing is adjourned.